Okay, so we're continuing with the Black Death or the Black Plague, bubonic plague in Europe. That's where we stopped last time. This is the third video, so you want to go watch the other two first. Oh, it's snowing outside. Big snowflakes floating around like feathers. Okay, so let's get back into this. So economic. With such a large population declined from the pandemic, wages soared in response to a labor shortage. There weren't people to do work. You had to pay them a lot more money in order to get someone to do work for you instead of working for someone else. On the other hand, in the quarter century after the Black Death in England, it is clear many laborers, artisans, and craftsmen, those living from money wages alone, did suffer a reduction in real incomes owing to rampant inflation. So, people didn't have as much money to spend on unnecessary things. Okay, so artisans and craftsmen suffered terribly as a result of this because people didn't have extra money to buy crafts and arts because the cost of bread and everything was too high. And the cost of bread and stuff was too high because you didn't have as many people to work the fields, right? So landowners were also pushed to substitute monetary rents for labor services in an effort to keep tenants. Okay. Environmental. Some historians believe the innumerable deaths brought on by the pandemic cooled the climate by freeing up land and triggering reforestation. This may have led to the Little Ice Age. Let's have a look at what that is. The Little Ice Age is a period of cooling that occurred after the medieval warm period. Although it was not a true ice age, the term was introduced into scientific literature by this guy here in 1939. It has been conventionally defined as a period extending from the 16th to the 19th centuries, but some experts prefer an alternative time span from about 1300 to 1850. So what happened to global warming? We had the Little Ice Age here. So, of course, anything warmer than that is going to look like global warming, right? All right, so that's what it was. All right, let's go back to here. It's not very interesting. Let's get rid of the Justinian one and go back to here. There we go. All right, so persecutions. Here we go. Renewed religious fervor and fanaticism bloomed in the wake of the Black Death. Some Europeans targeted various groups such as Jews, friars like monks, foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, lepers. Pilgrims were literal religious pilgrims, people traveling to a specific holy site in order to show their dedication to God. And sometimes they would also be promised some sort of, credit towards purgatory, to help someone spend less time in purgatory, for example. Now, understand that Martin Luther did not deny purgatory. He believed in purgatory. Okay? So the Reformers didn't deny purgatory, at least at the beginning. Okay? And Luther did believe in purgatory. The Lutherans believed in purgatory. So, when you say, oh, purgatory, that's not real, that doesn't exist. Well, hey, listen, Martin Luther, who's the father of the Reformation, believed in purgatory. He didn't deny that at all. He denied the Pope had authority in order to, give time out of purgatory, which there's strong arguments in the scripture that he did have that authority. I'm not saying that because I'm a Catholic or something like that. No, I'm just saying because, whatever we bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever we loose on earth will be loose in heaven. And if the Pope was seen at that time as he was, as the head of the church, that meant that the church had that power to do that. Okay? So there could be a very strong argument for it if you keep it in context of the time. Right? Now we look at it and we go, well, the Pope doesn't have authority at all, the church, blah, blah, blah. But at the time he did. Understand? There were no Protestant churches. So, all right, let's keep going here. Romani, which were the gypsies, blaming them for the crisis. Lepers and others with skin diseases such as acne or psoriasis were killed throughout Europe. So if you had acne, they would kill you. They were afraid of it. They thought that that had something to do with the Black Death, or psoriasis, which is like a skin disease where your skin is flaking and red. They kill you because they thought, well, that could be connected with it, because no one knew how the Black Death came to Europe or how it spread, and we still don't. It's all speculation. We do not know. Because 14th century healers and governments were at a loss to explain or stop the disease, Europeans turned to astrological forces, earthquakes, and the poisoning of wells by Jews as possible reasons for outbreaks. Many believed the epidemic was a punishment by God for their sins and could be relieved by winning God's forgiveness. How about by stopping sinning? There were many attacks against Jewish communities. In the Strasbourg massacre of February 1349, about 2,000 Jews were murdered. In August 1349, the Jewish communities of Mainz and Cologne were annihilated, like completely done away with. By 1351, 60 major and 150 smaller Jewish communities had been destroyed. During this period, many Jews relocated to Poland, where they received a warm welcome from the king Casimir the Great. Okay. So you see how so many Jews ended up in Poland. And that then, of course, led to Hitler's cleansing of the Jews in Poland. So let's keep going here. Social. One theory that has been advanced is that the devastation in Florence caused by the Black Plague, which hit Europe between 1348 and 1350, resulted in a shift in the worldview of people in 14th century Italy and led to the Renaissance. All right, this is what I've said many times, that even secular historians recognize that the Renaissance came out of the loss of hope from the Black Plague, from the massive death surrounding you and the expectation of dying any time now, any moment even. And losing this hope that the church could intervene with God to stop this. Italy was particularly badly hit by the pandemic, and it has been speculated that the resulting familiarity with death caused thinkers to dwell more on their lives on earth rather than on spirituality and the afterlife. This is modern thinking of trying to romanticize it. You don't need to romanticize it in order to understand how this shift happened. I just explained how it happened. You gave up hope in the authority that was there to intervene between you and God, the church. The church's role was to mediate between the parishioner and God. And you say, oh, but there's only one mediator between man and God, Jesus Christ. Okay, but that's not how they saw it at that time. They did see that Jesus was mediating between man and God. But they saw that the physical manifestation of that on earth was the church. And the clergy were dedicated to serving the people, as St. Paul had, and St. Peter. Don't be bothered that I say saint, because they were saints. More certainly they were saints than you are a saint. But I'm not saying you're not a saint, but stop sinning so that you can be a saint. So, we can understand how the transition took place without romanticizing it. It has also been argued that the Black Death prompted a new wave of piety, manifested in the sponsorship of religious works of art. Now that I can believe. When you're surrounded by this kind of suffering and devastation, some people respond by giving up hope and just wanting to die. Some people respond with violence and crime, and some people respond by looking at themselves and saying, what have I done? How can I change this? And they become more pious. However, this does not fully explain why the Renaissance occurred specifically in Italy in the 14th century. The Black Death was a pandemic that affected all of Europe in the ways described, not only Italy. Yeah, but you forget that the Greek and Roman gods were carried through the Italian culture. So where better to find the Renaissance happen, where they turned to the Greek and Roman gods again for answers and inspiration and put that into the art? Where better to find that than Italy? Of course, Italy. So they're overlooking that. It says the Renaissance's emergence in Italy was most likely the result of the complex interaction of the above factors in combination with an influx of Greek scholars following the fall of the Byzantine Empire. As a result of the decimation in the populace, the value of the working class increased, and commoners came to enjoy more freedom. To answer the increased need for labor, workers traveled in search of the most favorable positions economically. Now we start to see the rise of the individual over the authority that had been over them before. And this is what I have to say, is that when you look at the mark of the hunted game animal, the mark of the beast, it's 666. Now it could be 616, but that's for another video, okay? So 666. 6 is the number of man. We know that because it says so. And 3 represents divinity. And we know that as well. So this is man in God's place. Okay? Man not believing that there should be any authority over himself, putting himself up to the highest authority over himself, which is God. Saying there's no God over me, and therefore there's no other authority that can be over me as well. And that worked itself out through this whole great rebellion. Okay? And this is the first part of it, where the value of the common laborer increased so much that the common worker could actually travel from region to region looking for the most favorable opportunities. That was unheard of. That was unheard of. Okay? So the value of the individual at the lowest part of society had been elevated in such a way that there was room made for that individual to have authority over his own life. Okay? And you say, well, of course, and that's a good thing. I'm not saying if it's good or bad. I'm just saying that it is. I'm saying that it is. That was part of the beginning of the movement of the Great Rebellion, where man exalted himself, or was exalted, to the place of God. So that today, we don't feel like there's any authority who has legitimate authority over us, inherently legitimate authority. We say, well, the police have authority over us because, there needs to be law and order, and it's a practical thing that if we don't, then there's going to be crime, and there's going to be murder and rape, and so they have to have authority over the people, But you don't think that there is some sort of inherent authority over you? Or the government over you? Well, the government, they're elected officials, they represent the people, and they're supposed to represent our will, right? And so they don't have some sort of inherent authority over us. It's authority that we give to them. You hear yourself. That we give to them over us. It's meaning they don't have authority over us. They only have authority that we pretend to let them have. We let them have. Yeah? And if we don't want to let them have, we don't have to let them have. We can tear it all down and burn it all down. See, this is what I'm talking about. This is the 666. This is the man in God's place. That the individual is exalted above all authority. And all authority exists only at the permission of the individuals as a mass. This is what the Great Rebellion was moving towards. Okay? Let's keep going. As a result of the decimation, all right, we got that, all right? Prior to the emergence of the Black Death, the workings of Europe were run by the Catholic Church, and the continent was considered a feudalistic society composed of fiefs and city-states. The pandemic completely restructured both religion and political forces. Survivors began to turn to other forms of spirituality, and the power dynamics of the fiefs and city-states crumbled. So understand that feudalistic society, it really carried on a lot longer after that, especially in places like the southern United States with the plantations. that was a feudalistic system where you had a landowner and you had workers. And the workers lived on the land, and the landowner gave them a place to live and was responsible for their health care, responsible for their breeding even in most cases. And telling who can breed with who, right? Oh, you can marry each other. You had to get the permission of the landowner to marry. And so you couldn't just up and leave the land. You belonged to the landowner. And you couldn't just up and leave and go somewhere else because they would say, well, where are you from? You had to have a reference from your previous landowner, right? And so this also is the foundation of our modern idea of landlord when you rent a place. So we still have some feudalism that still permeates our society at some level, and getting references of where you lived before, right? This is also from that system. So it didn't just disappear. Cairo's population, partly owing to the numerous plague epidemics, was in the early 18th century half of what it was in 1347. The populations of some Italian cities, notably Florence, did not regain their pre-14th century size until the 19th century, the 1800s. The demographic decline due to the pandemic had economic consequences. The prices of food dropped, and land values declined by 30 to 40% in most parts of Europe between 1350 and 1400. Landholders faced a great loss, but for ordinary men and women, it was a windfall, because landowners didn't have the labor force they needed in order to produce. And so they had less money as well. So they were not providing as good of circumstance for the laborers, and therefore the laborers went somewhere else. So the survivors of the pandemic found not only that the prices of food were lower, but also the lands were more abundant, and many of them inherited property from their dead relatives, and this probably destabilized feudalism. I have a lot to say about that, but it's not relevant to what we're talking about. The word quarantine has its roots in this period, though the concept of isolating people to prevent the spread of disease is older. In the city-state of Ragusa, in Dubrovnik, Croatia, a 30-day isolation period was implemented in 1377 for new arrivals to the city from plague-affected areas. The isolation period was later extended to 40 days and given the name quarantino, from the Italian word for 40. So 40 days, quarantino. So the idea of quarantine was that it was supposed to be 40 days. Recurrences. Second plague pandemic. The plague repeatedly returned to haunt Europe and the Mediterranean throughout the 14th to 17th centuries. Okay, let me see if I can find this graphic that I saw, and I'll show you this. Okay, this is from the History Channel. I just want to read through this little timeline here and give you some overview along the timeline of what's going on. This is not so bad. It's not as thorough as it should be, but it's okay. It'll give you a bit more respect for what happened and a bit of fear. So the strain of Y. pestis emerges in Mongolia, according to John Kelly's account in The Great Mortality. It is possibly passed to humans by a marmot, type of marmot. The deadliest outbreak is in the Mongol capital of Sarai, which the Mongols carried west to the Black Sea area. Mongol king Jeneberg and his army are in the nearby city of Tana when a brawl erupts between Italian merchants and a group of Muslims. Following the death of one of the Muslims, the Italians flee by sea to the Genoese outpost of Kaffa, and Jeneberg followed on land. Upon arrival at Kaffa, Jeneberg's army lays siege for a year, but they are stricken with an outbreak. As the army catapults the infected bodies of their dead over city walls, the under siege Genoese become infected also. This is biological warfare. It's exactly that. It's biological warfare. They knew those bodies were infected and died from this infection. We didn't understand infections at the time, but they understood that they had this disease. They died from the disease. They were going to throw it over the wall so that hopefully it would kill them too. It was biological warfare. So That was 1346. May 1347. Both sides in the siege are decimated and survivors in Kaffa escape by sea, leaving behind streets covered with corpses being fed on by feral animals, wild animals. One ship arrives in Constantinople, which once infected loses as much as 90% of its population. October 1347. Another Caffin ship docks in Sicily, the crew barely alive. Here the plague kills half the population and moves to Messina. Fleeing residents then spread it to the mainland, Italy, where 1/3 of the population is dead by the following summer. Unbelievable. That's October. And by the following summer, about 9 months later, 1/3 of the population is dead in mainland Italy. November 1347, the plague arrives in France. So that's a month after it starts in Italy. The plague arrives in France, brought by another of the Kaffa ships docking in Marseille. It spreads quickly throughout the country. And it says a new strain enters Europe. A different plague strain enters Europe through Genoa, brought by another Caffin ship that docks there. The Genoans attack the ship and drive it away, but they are still infected. Italy faces the second strain while already battling the previous one. Y. Pestis also heads east from Sicily into the Persian Empire and through Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, and south to Egypt as well as Cyprus, which is also hit with the destruction from an earthquake and deadly tidal wave at the same time. Can you imagine being hit by the Black Plague and also an earthquake and also a deadly tidal wave all at once? That was Cyprus. Venice faces its own outbreak by pioneering the first organized response, with committees ordering ship inspections and burning those with contagions, shutting down taverns and restricting wine from unknown sources. The canals fill with gondolas shouting official instructions for disposing of dead bodies. Despite those efforts, the plague kills 60% of the Venetian population. So even with those efforts of organizing and ordering how to deal with this, still 60% of the population die. That was January 1348. April 1348, the plague awakes an anti-Semitic rage around Europe. Causing repeated massacres of Jewish communities, with the first one taking place in Provence, where 40 Jews were murdered. June 1348. The plague enters England through the port of Malcolm Regis in Dorset. As it spreads through the town, some escape by fleeing inland, inadvertently spreading it further. So they already had it, and they spread it further with them. Summer 1348. A group of religious zealots known as the Flagellants first begin to appear in Germany. These groups of anywhere from 50 to 500 hooded and half-naked men march, sing, and thrash themselves with lashes until swollen and bloody. Originally the practice of 11th century Italian monks during an epidemic, they spread out through Europe, also known for their violent anti-Semitism. The Flagellants mysteriously disappeared by 1350. The plague hits Marseille, France, Paris, and Normandy, and then the strain splits, with one strain moving on to the now Belgian city of Tournai to the east, and the other passing through Calais and Avignon, where 50% of the population dies. The plague also moves through Austria and Switzerland, where a fury of anti-Semitic massacres follow it along the Rhine after a rumor spreads that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells, as Jennifer Wright details in her book, Get Well Soon, History's Worst Plagues and the Heroes Who Fought Them. In towns throughout Germany and France, Jewish communities were completely annihilated. In response, King Casimir III of Poland offers a safe haven to the persecuted Jews, starting a mass migration to Poland and Lithuania. Marseille is also considered a safe haven for Jews. Black Plague reaches London, Scotland, and beyond. October 1348, following the infection and death of King Edward III's daughter, Princess Joan, the plague reaches London. Following the infection and death of King Edward III's daughter, Princess Joan, the plague reaches London, according to this book by Colin Platt. As the devastation grows, Londoners flee to the countryside to find food. Edward blames the plague on garbage and human excrement piled up in London streets and in the Thames River. So the king blames the garbage and the human poop that's in the streets in the Thames River. Well, that's not a bad guess. So that was October 1348. February 1349, a few months later, one of the worst massacres of Jews during the Black Death takes place on Valentine's Day in Strasbourg, with 2,000 Jewish people burned alive. In the spring, 3,000 Jews defend themselves in Mainz against Christians, but are overcome and slaughtered. April 1349. The plague hits Wales, brought by people fleeing from southern England, and eventually kills 100,000 people there. So, people wanted to blame Jews for this disease. And there's some reason behind that. Because you understand that they didn't have Bibles to read for themselves. They had to just remember what they heard in church. And there are a lot of things that are said from the New Testament about the Jews of the Old Testament and the Jews of Jesus' time that are very negative. For example, that they had sinned against God so egregiously and so many times that God finally absolutely cut them off and that there was a curse on them. Now it also says that if they turn and start to believe, then they will be accepted again. Right? That's in Romans. But people didn't have Bibles to read. They didn't know there was a Romans 11 and a Romans 10 because they didn't exist at that time. There were no chapters in the Bible. There were no verses in the Bible. Those were put in by Stephanus in about 1550 or something like that. In the printed Bible. That's where they appeared. So this is a couple hundred years before that. The Bible didn't even have verses or chapters, and people didn't have Bibles. It's too expensive. There was no printing press. All right. So blaming the Jews, you say, well, that's horrible. How could they should know better than that? That's so racist, No, it wasn't that kind of thing. It was that they heard in church, preached from the Bible, that the Jews were cursed by God. And here's a dramatic curse coming on them. How could they not think, after trying to solve it and not finding a solution, that, hold on, maybe it's because of the Jews being here with us. Their curse is now falling on our head. You could also have thought it if you lived at that time. You wouldn't have been enlightened as you are today. You would have thought also, hold on, the Jews have a curse on them and they're living among us. Maybe this is God saying, don't accept them to live among you because they have a curse on them. Get rid of them. So, July 1349, an English ship brings the Black Death to Norway when it runs aground in Bergen. The ship's crew is dead by the end of the week, and the pestilence travels to Denmark and Sweden, where the king believes fasting on a Friday and foregoing shoes on Sunday will please God and end the plague. It doesn't work. Killing 2 of the king's brothers and moving into Russia and also eastern Greenland, forcing the Vikings to halt their exploration of North America. So, the discovery of North America and its exploration was halted by the Black Plague. March 1350. Scotland, having so far avoided the plague, hopes to take advantage of English weakness by amassing an army and planning an invasion. Oh, brilliant plan. Invade a country that's filled with plague. Yeah, while yours isn't. It's a death wish, I guess. All right, while waiting on the border to begin the attack, troops became infected, with 5,000 dying. Choosing to retreat, the soldiers bring the disease back to their families, and a third of Scotland perishes. Well, that'll teach them. Black Death fades, leaving half of Europe dead. The Scottish wanted to take advantage of the weakness of the English in their calamity, in their suffering. And the result was punishment upon them and their families, and a third of them died. 1 out of 3 people throughout Scotland died because of that decision. Black Death fades, leaving half of Europe dead. 1351, the plague's spread significantly begins to peter out, possibly thanks to quarantine efforts after causing the deaths of anywhere between 25 to 50 million people, and leading to the massacres of 210 Jewish communities. All total, Europe has lost about 50% of its population. You don't know that the quarantine methods are what caused it to recede. You don't know that. You don't know that. It's complete, pure speculation. You don't know that. 1353. With the Black Death considered safely behind them, the people of Europe faced a changed society. The combination of the massive death rate and the numbers of survivors fleeing their homes sends entrenched social and economic systems spiraling. You had to flee your home because there was death there. People abandoned their lands where they lived, where generations of their family lived. They abandoned them. It becomes easier to get work for better wages, and the average standard of living rises. With the feudal system dying, the aristocracy tries to pass laws preventing any further rise by the peasants, leading to upheaval and revolution in England and France. Significant losses within older intellectual communities brought on an unprecedented opportunity for new ideas and art concepts to take hold, directly leading to the Renaissance and a more youthful, enlightened period of human history. Notice they say enlightened period. They like to make it seem like there was something brilliant and more aware and beautiful and smart and wise in it. And they've always done this about the Renaissance. They've always done this. When it was a time of idolatry and abandoning God and abandoning the institution that he put on earth through Jesus Christ, the church. The bubonic plague, that's the Black Plague, never completely exits, resurfacing several times throughout the centuries. Okay? All right, so here it says it returned to haunt Europe and the Mediterranean throughout the 14th to 17th centuries. That's 300 years. The plague was present somewhere in Europe in every year between 1346 and 1671. So, the second pandemic was particularly widespread in the following years. You can see the years right there. Massive. Subsequent outbreaks, though severe, marked the retreat from most of Europe, 18th century, and northern Africa, 19th century. Historian George Sussman argued that the plague had not occurred in East Africa until the 1900s. However, other sources suggest that the second pandemic did indeed reach sub-Saharan Africa. All right, so answer me this. Is it why? Why would it recede? I mean, it still comes in, still hits, still kills some people, but not as many. It's not a virus, it's a bacteria. All right, so France alone lost almost 1 million people to the plague in the epidemic of 1628 to 31. In 3 years, they lost almost 1 million people. In the first half of the 17th century, a plague claimed some 1.7 million victims in Italy. More than 1.25 million deaths resulted in the extreme incidents of plague in 17th century Spain. The Black Death ravaged much of the Islamic world. Plague was present in at least one location in the Islamic world virtually every year between 1500 and 1850, 350 years. Plague repeatedly struck the cities of North Africa. Algiers lost 30,000 to 50,000 between 1620 to 21, and again 1654 to 57, 1665, 1691, 1740 to 42. Cairo suffered more than 50 plague epidemics within 150 years from the plague's first appearance, with the final outbreak of the second pandemic there in the 1840s. Plague remained a major event in Ottoman society until the second quarter of the 19th century. Between 1701 and 1750, 37 larger and smaller epidemics were recorded in Constantinople, and an additional 31 between 1751 and 1800. Baghdad has suffered severely from visitations of the plague, and sometimes 2/3 of its population has been wiped out. Sometimes, that means more than once. The third plague epidemic, 1855 to 1859, that's the 19th century. Started in China in the mid-19th century, spreading to all inhabited continents and killing 10 million people in India alone. 10 million people. Only in India. But it spread throughout the world. The investigation of the pathogen that caused the 19th century plague was begun by teams of scientists who visited Hong Kong in 1894, among whom was a French-Swiss bacteriologist, Alexander Yersin, after whom the pathogen was named. 12 plague outbreaks in Australia between 1900 and 1925 resulted in well over 1,000 deaths. So that's not so many compared to the rest before, mostly in Sydney. This led to the establishment of a public health department there, which undertook some leading-edge research on plague transmission from rat fleas to humans via the Bacillus Yersinia pestis. The first North American plague epidemic was the San Francisco plague of 1900 to 1904, followed by another outbreak in 1907 to 1908. Modern day. Modern treatment methods including insecticides and use of antibiotics and a plague vaccine. It is feared that the plague bacterium could develop drug resistance and again become a major health threat. One case of a drug-resistant form of the bacterium was found in Madagascar in 1995. A further outbreak in Madagascar was reported in November 2014. In October 2017, the deadliest outbreak of the plague in modern times hit Madagascar, killing 170 people and infecting thousands. An estimate of the case fatality rate for the modern bubonic plague following the introduction of antibiotics is 11%, although it may be higher in underdeveloped regions. Okay, so now you get this probably too much information, right, about the plague, but you have an idea about what it was and what it did. You can see here on this picture, this is Europe, and this is year by year, blow by blow play, right? So you can see the dark green was the first year. That's over here in the right. Here's the Black Sea. Here's Ukraine. I'm up in here. Here's Crimea right here. So Ukraine goes around up like this and around like this and over like this. And I'm up over in here somewhere. There's Kiev and there's Krakow. So I'm up over in about here on the line between these two. So the dark green is where it hit first. And 1346, 1347 is the lime green. So you can see it spread here, 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 Constantinople, around here, Cyprus, Greece. You can see Sicily, across to here. The next year, 1348, is the skin-colored. So that's right here. I guess that's this. And I don't know if this is skin-colored or not. Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, the skin-colored. All this is skin-colored up here. Italy, all of the Balkans, part of England by then, and Ireland even. And then 1349, the fourth year, is the orange or tangerine colored areas. And notice there are no other colors after that over in here. So that was the last year for the Middle East. But over here, you got the tangerine color, and tangerine color here, kind of, that's it for here. But, I mean, it doesn't mean it went away. I mean, it could have actually still been in these areas, right? I'm sure it was. But that was when it first entered, okay? So it first entered here, then it entered here, because that's the next color, this raspberry color. You can see the raspberry up here in Scotland. We already read about how it entered Scotland and Denmark and parts of Sweden, right around Stockholm, you know, and then we've got this color here, kind of the rust color, brick colored. So the brick color is most of Poland and up into Lithuania and up in here, including Estonia as well. And that's it. That was the main traveling area of that. And then 1352 is into Russia, okay, and parts of Ukraine up here too, Kiev. So you got Moscow here as well. And then the last year, 1353, the last one that they have on the map is up over in here. Okay, so you can see the way it traveled. It started here and it ended here. Ironically, it started here and it ended here, just across from it. So it kind of went down, spread out a little bit across this, went back up over in here, and went back up over in here. They don't have anything about Finland up here or up further north. Okay. So, but I hope you got a good view of what went on here. Let me pull this back up. And I hope you can see just the amount of devastation and how persistent it was. And while there were periods of time where like half the people died, or a third of the people died, or even 90% of the people died, we read in one case, that even when you had these peak times where it just massively wiped out people, you still had this barrage after barrage, bam, 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 throughout hundreds of years of this hitting the population. And so even if they'd gotten over even the second outbreak, the second pandemic, right, the second plague, that even if they had recovered mentally from that and started to respect and submit to the Catholic Church again, that even if they had, that the successive blow by blow by blow by blow continuing and not relenting just reminded them of that. And I'm sure that, you know, with culture, they embedded that experience in culture through songs and fairy tales and all kinds of warnings, proverbs, and you know, yeah. So it lived on through culture. It lived on through culture. And I understand that, let me just check a minute. Hold on. So what I wanted to show you here just briefly before we end this is a very interesting thing that I remember hearing somewhere, and I've just checked up on it. And in fact, it seems to be a fake explanation. And the origins and meanings of the game, this is the ring around the rosies, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Now, you'll say, hold, that's not how it goes. Yeah, I'm an American though. And the colonies, that's how it went. Okay. And there are some people in America who have carried over traditions through their German heritage or other, you know, avenues where they've got a variant. Okay. That's right. There are many variants here. If you go to the Wikipedia page, you'll find tons of variants here, going all the way down here. British variant, American variant, Indian variant, Maori, you know, all kinds of variants of this, including from the 19th century, a few different, really radically different versions of it. And then you got some German versions of it as well, an Italian one. All right, but down here it says a great plague explanation of the mid-20th century. Since after the Second World War, the rhyme has often been associated with the Great Plague, which happened in England in 1665. That's the Black Plague, still, right? Or with earlier outbreaks of the Black Death in England. Interpreters of the rhyme before World War II make no mention of this. By 1951, however, it seems to have become well established as an explanation for the form of the rhyme that had become standard in the UK. Peter and Iona Opie, the leading authorities on nursery rhymes, remarked, "The invariable sneezing and falling down in modern English versions have given would-be origin finders the opportunity to say that the rhyme dates back to the Great Plague. A rosy rash, they allege, was a symptom of the plague, and posies of herbs were carried as protection and to ward off the smell of the disease. Sneezing or coughing was a final fatal symptom, and all fall down was exactly what happened." The line "ashes, ashes" in colonial versions of the rhyme is claimed to refer variously to cremation of the bodies, the burning of the victims' houses, or blackening of their skin, and the theory has been adapted to be applied to other versions of the rhyme. In its various forms, the interpretation has entered into popular culture and has been used elsewhere to make oblique references to the plague. Okay? All right. So, yeah. And we might even find the origins of racism against blacks being strengthened in the blackening of the skin from the Black Plague, hence the Black Plague. So the 14th century may actually mark, especially the 14th century, may actually mark, the arrival, or strengthening of racism against blacks. Now, at this point, I'm just speculating about that, okay? Based on the fact that you had this plague that wiped out most of Europe, and the hallmark feature was the turning of the skin to black. Right. So there might be something there. If you're interested, you might investigate that and just check and see. Now, someone's going to get very angry at me, right? I'm not saying that black people are evil or black people are bad or they've got the plague or anything like that. There's no connection between it. I'm just saying that in medieval Europe in the 14th century, it is possible that people could have seen that and then looked at black people and said, well, there's some sort of connection there. I don't want anything to do with them. It's possible, right? It could have strengthened that kind of racism. The important thing here is that all of this hinges around our examination of others and our examinations of our structures and our societies, our examination of God himself, and our examinations of ourselves. When these things happen and many people are dying, and we know some of them, then we start to examine all of these and ask, what's wrong? The most important one, though, is here. And if you can examine yourself and you ask God, help me to find what's wrong and correct it, and you find what's wrong and you correct it, even if you're not the source of the suffering, even if that thing that you've corrected is not the reason God allowed you to suffer in that way, or allowed others to suffer because they had something similar, some similar problem in them, right? And you've got it in you, and you might also suffer and die as well. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's what's really going on. And so you examining and correcting that gives you a chance, for it to pass over you, right? Like the Passover. But even if it's not the reason, and it's some other reason, you have corrected some fatal problem in your soul. It could end up causing you to lose your life anyway, in another way. And you've just saved your life. So it's a good thing to examine yourself, find the flaws, especially the fatal flaws, and correct them. And you'll live. May the Lord bless you as you seek him with all your heart. Remember to subscribe down below and like the video and share it on your Facebook and other social media. And then make a comment, whether a question or a comment. We read all of them and we try to respond to all. Get on over to our website, The Rooted Word, and start reading the translation and also the articles we've posted. It's at therootedword.com, therootedword.com. And may the Lord bless you as you seek him with all your heart.